I placed the heavy crystal salad bowl onto the mahogany dining table, the glass clinking sharply against the polished wood. My mother-in-law, Vivian, did not even blink. She just took a slow, deliberate sip of her expensive chardonnay, looked right through me, and said, "The help does not eat with family, Jada. You can go fix yourself a plate in the kitchen." I did not flinch. I did not cry. I just smiled, leaned forward, and replied, "Actually, Vivian, I own this resort, and your checkout time is right now. My name is Jada. I am 35 years old, and I spent the last 5 years letting my husband's family treat me like dirt beneath their designer shoes." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand your ground against a toxic family who severely underestimated your worth. Trust me, you are going to want to hear exactly how I dismantled their fake empire piece by piece. Exactly 48 hours before that dinner, the tension inside our luxury SUV was already suffocating. My husband Julian had been complaining since we crossed the bridge onto Martha's Vineyard. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were turning gray. He was sweating through his crisp linen shirt, obsessing over the price of premium gas and the steep cost of the ferry tickets. But underneath the endless complaints about money, I knew the real reason he was so on edge. It was our annual summer trip to Oakhaven Estate. This was the sprawling historic resort his mother Vivian insisted the family visit every single year to maintain their elite image among their peers. Julian was terrified of stepping out of line and losing his mother's conditional approval. Julian adjusted the rearview mirror and sighed heavily. He told me I knew how his mother got and begged me to just let her have her way this weekend. He demanded I not start any arguments about business and pleaded with me to just agree with whatever Chloe said. Chloe was his sister-in-law, married to his older brother Trey. Chloe was a white woman who constantly weaponized her tears and passive aggression, and Vivian treated her like absolute royalty because she supposedly came from New England old money. I sat silently in the passenger seat, watching the dark blue ocean roll by out the window, keeping my face completely neutral. I grew up in a working-class neighborhood in Atlanta. I knew what real struggle looked like, and I knew what actual hard work was. I had spent the last decade building a boutique hospitality investment firm from nothing, pouring every ounce of my energy into acquiring struggling commercial properties and turning them around into highly profitable ventures. Yet to Vivian and the rest of Julian's family, I would always just be the charity case. They viewed my ambition as tacky and my Southern background as an embarrassment to their carefully curated image. They loved to parade me around at family functions as proof of their open-mindedness, while quietly tearing me down the moment no outsiders were listening. We turned onto the long private driveway leading up to Oakhaven Estate. Towering century-old oak trees lined the perfectly paved road, their thick branches creating a lush green canopy over the car. Julian wiped his forehead, his anxiety practically vibrating through the leather seats. He started aggressively rehearsing his greetings, muttering about how Trey was probably already at the golf course, networking with politicians and hedge fund managers. Julian always shrunk himself around his brother. Trey was the golden child of the family, the one who supposedly ran a massive logistics empire, the one who could do absolutely no wrong in Vivian's eyes. Julian was just the younger brother desperately trying to secure a crumb of the family legacy. As the grand colonial architecture of the resort main lodge finally came into view, Julian let out a shaky breath and gripped my arm. He told me to remember that we were guests here. He reminded me that Vivian was paying for this trip, so we had to play by her rules. He strictly warned me not to do anything to embarrass the family name. I looked at the sprawling manicured green lawns, the immaculate white columns of the lodge, and the valet staff rushing out in their pressed uniforms to meet the incoming cars. I felt a deep, profound sense of calm wash over my entire body. Julian had absolutely no idea that for the past 2 years, while he called my investment firm a stupid pipe dream and flatly refused to support my business goals to protect his own assets, I had been working relentlessly, He had no idea that 3 weeks ago, my limited liability company had officially closed a massive, quiet deal to acquire Oakhaven Estate in its entirety. The previous owners had been silently bleeding money, and I swooped in with a cash offer they could not refuse. I owned the driveway we just drove on. I owned the lobby we were about to walk into. I owned the very ground Julian was currently shaking on. Julian threw the SUV into park and immediately jumped out to start frantically unloading the luggage, already looking around nervously for any sign of his mother. I stayed in the passenger seat for just a moment longer, breathing in the salty coastal air. I reached into my designer purse and pulled out my phone. I opened a secure text thread with a contact I had saved simply as Sterling. Sterling was the seasoned general manager of the resort, a brilliant man who now answered exclusively to me. My fingers flew across the screen as I typed out a quick, decisive message, arriving at the main entrance in 10 minutes. Remember our arrangement. Treat me exactly like a regular guest, and under no circumstances do you reveal my identity to my in-laws. I locked my phone, slipped it back into my bag, and stepped out into the warm afternoon sun. The trap was set. Now, all I had to do was smile and let my husband's family dig their own graves. Walking through the towering glass doors of the main lodge felt entirely different this year. The expansive lobby was a masterpiece of coastal elegance. Polished marble floors gleamed under the light of custom-blown glass chandeliers. To my left, a string quartet played softly in the corner, and to my right, the concierge desk was bustling with well-dressed guests. I noticed the subtle upgrades immediately. The fresh orchids on the tables, the pristine uniforms of the bellhops, the subtle scent of sea salt and cedar in the air. These were all changes I had implemented 2 weeks ago. It was breathtaking, and it was entirely mine. But the serene atmosphere was instantly shattered by the sharp, demanding voice echoing from the center of the room. There she was, Vivian. She was standing by the grand fireplace, wearing a massive sun hat and a silk resort dress that probably cost more than her actual mortgage. She was holding court, loudly snapping her fingers at a young bellhop who was struggling to balance her 6 matching designer suitcases. Next to her stood Trey, looking like he had just stepped out of a country club catalog in his pastel polo and expensive loafers. He was already loudly bragging to a captive audience of strangers about his golf handicap. And clinging to his arm was Chloe. She wore an oversized pair of sunglasses indoors and a pristine white linen outfit that screamed old money cosplay. When she saw us approaching, Chloe offered a tight, pitying smile. Julian immediately quickened his pace, practically jogging over to his mother like a lost puppy. He went in for a hug, but Vivian stiff-armed him, offering only a heavily powdered cheek for him to kiss. She looked him up and down with clear disappointment before her eyes slid over to me. Her expression instantly soured, as if I were a stain on the immaculate marble floor. "Well, look who finally decided to show up," Vivian announced loudly, ensuring the other guests in the lobby could hear her. She sighed dramatically, fanning herself with a glossy resort brochure. "I was beginning to think your little rented car broke down on the highway. We have been waiting here for 20 minutes. Julian immediately began stuttering out apologies, blaming the ferry traffic, blaming the gas station attendants, essentially blaming everyone but himself. I simply stood there, keeping my posture straight and my expression carefully blank. I offered a polite greeting, ignoring the blatant disrespect. Vivian waved away Julian's pathetic excuses and reached into her designer tote bag. She pulled out a small stack of sleek electronic room keys. She held them up like a monarch distributing rations to her starving peasants. "Now then," Vivian began, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I have already handled the room assignments. Trey, Chloe, darling, come here." She handed them a heavy silver keycard holder. "You two are in the oceanfront penthouse. It has a private wrap-around balcony and a jacuzzi. I know Chloe is so used to the finer things, and I wanted to make sure my beautiful daughter-in-law gets the rest she deserves." Chloe clasped her hands over her chest, feigning surprise. "Oh, Vivian, you are just too generous." We really do not need a penthouse. But Trey puffed out his chest, snatching the key from his mother. Nonsense, babe, Trey said loudly. Only the best for us. Besides, a guy needs room to stretch out after closing major deals all quarter. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to stop from laughing. I knew exactly what kind of deals Trey was closing. Absolutely none. Vivian beamed with pride before pocketing the second keycard. I have secured the master suite for myself on the top floor, of course. My back simply cannot handle substandard mattresses, and the management here knows I expect premium accommodations. Finally, Vivian held out a single plain plastic keycard toward Julian. He reached for it eagerly, but Vivian pulled it back an inch, looking directly at me with a smirk that chilled the air around us. Julian, I got you and Jada a room on the ground floor. It is Unit 114. Vivian paused, letting the silence stretch out so the insult could properly land. Now it is located down the east corridor, right next to the industrial laundry vents. There is no ocean view, and the square footage is quite modest. But I figured Jada would feel right at home. After all, growing up in those cramped little working-class neighborhoods down in Atlanta, she is used to small spaces. It might actually be comforting for her. Chloe let out a sudden, sharp giggle before slapping a hand over her mouth. "Oh my gosh, Vivian, you are so bad," she whispered loudly. Trey openly chuckled, shaking his head. I looked at Julian, waiting for him to defend his wife. I waited for the man I married to stand up, clear his throat, and tell his mother that her comment was entirely out of line. Instead, Julian let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh. He reached out, took the plastic keycard from his mother, and shrugged. "Come on, Ma, you know, Jada does not mind," Julian said, refusing to meet my eyes. He turned to me, his voice taking on a warning edge. "Right, Jada. We are just happy to be included. You should be grateful my mother paid for us to even be here. It is a free vacation, so just say thank you and do not make a big deal out of nothing." A heavy, suffocating silence fell between us. The sheer disrespect was not new, but the blatant public nature of it was escalating. They were testing me. They wanted to see if I would crack, if I would throw a tantrum and prove their narrative that I was just an angry, unrefined woman who did not belong in their upper-class world. I looked at Vivian's triumphant smirk. I looked at Chloe's mocking pity. I looked at Trey's arrogant sneer. And finally, I looked at the man who was supposed to be my partner in life, currently shrinking himself into nothing just to please them. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of anger. Instead, I let a slow, chillingly calm smile spread across my face. "You are absolutely right, Julian," I said, my voice smooth as glass. "I am incredibly grateful for everything your family has provided today." "Thank you, Vivian. The ground floor will be extremely illuminating." Vivian looked slightly thrown by my lack of resistance. She frowned, clearly disappointed that I had not given her the screaming match she so desperately wanted. "Well, go on then," she snapped. "Take your bags and get out of the lobby. You are blocking the walkway." Julian let out a massive sigh of relief, clearly thrilled that he had dodged a bullet. He immediately grabbed the heaviest suitcases and started marching toward the east corridor, shouting over his shoulder for me to follow him. I picked up my single leather duffel bag. But as Julian turned the corner, heading down the depressing hallway toward the laundry facilities, I stopped. I did not follow him. I adjusted my grip on my bag, turned on my heel, and walked in the exact opposite direction, heading straight toward the restricted solid oak doors of the executive suite. The heavy oak doors marked private closed behind me with a soft click, instantly silencing the chaotic hum of the main lobby. The executive suite was a stark contrast to the bustling public spaces of the resort. It was a haven of quiet authority, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of the private golf course and the crashing ocean beyond. The air smelled of rich espresso and expensive leather. Sitting behind a massive mahogany desk was Sterling, the general manager of Oak Haven Estate. Sterling was a distinguished man in his late 50s, dressed in an impeccably tailored navy suit. He had spent 30 years running luxury properties across the globe, and he knew how to spot true power the moment it walked into a room. As soon as I stepped onto the plush carpet, Sterling immediately stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and offered a warm, highly respectful smile. "Good afternoon, Ms. Jackson," Sterling said, his voice deep and professional. "Welcome to your resort." It was the first time I had heard those words spoken aloud on the property, and a profound sense of satisfaction settled into my bones. I walked over to the leather guest chairs and took a seat, crossing my legs. It had been exactly 3 weeks since my boutique hospitality firm quietly finalized the acquisition of Oakhaven Estate. The previous ownership group had been bleeding money for years. They were careless, allowing affluent guests to run up massive tabs without ever collecting payment, and ignoring crucial maintenance while pouring funds into superficial cosmetic upgrades. When my analysts brought me the financial reports, I saw a goldmine buried under layers of gross mismanagement. I purchased the entire estate through a blind limited liability company. It was a cash deal that saved the resort from imminent foreclosure. Not a single person outside of my legal team and Sterling knew the true identity of the new owner. "It is good to finally be here, Sterling, in person," I replied, setting my bag on the floor. "The lobby renovations look spectacular. The new floral arrangements and the upgraded lighting completely changed the arrival experience." "Thank you, ma'am," Sterling said, taking his seat. "We implemented all of your directives the moment the ink dried on the contracts. The staff is highly motivated. But if I may speak freely, I was quite surprised when I saw the room assignments your mother-in-law submitted for your family." I smiled a thin, knowing smile. "Let me guess, you wanted to intervene." Sterling nodded seriously. "I had the owner's villa prepared and fully staffed the moment I knew you were arriving this weekend. It sits on the secluded South Cliff. It features a private infinity pool, a dedicated personal chef, and a private driveway. I can have your luggage quietly moved there right now. You do not have to subject yourself to Unit 114. That room is practically a supply closet." I held up my hand to stop him. "No, Sterling. I am staying exactly where I was assigned. In fact, Unit 114 is the perfect strategic location for what I need to accomplish this weekend." Sterling looked curious but remained silent, waiting for me to explain. "My husband and his family believe I am suffering in the basement," I continued, keeping my voice steady and measured. "Because they think I am trapped out of sight and out of mind, they will not pay any attention to my movements. That gives me the absolute freedom to roam this entire property undetected. I am going to use this weekend to conduct a thorough, unannounced audit of the resort operations. I want to see how the kitchen functions during the dinner rush. I want to see how the housekeeping staff handles difficult requests. I need to observe the actual heartbeat of my investment without anyone putting on a show for the boss." Sterling nodded slowly, clearly impressed by the strategy. "It is a brilliant approach, ma'am. But what about your family? They are known to the staff here. Vivian and Trey have been coming for years, and they are notoriously demanding." "That brings me to my most important directive," I said, leaning forward and resting my arms on the mahogany desk. "I am enforcing a strict non-disclosure agreement for the duration of my stay. Every single employee on this property signed it last week. If any staff member refers to me as the owner or treats me differently than a standard guest, they will be terminated immediately. Is that completely understood?" "Crystal clear," Sterling confirmed without hesitation. "Furthermore, I want you to treat my in-laws exactly as you would treat any other guests. Do not offer them special favors. Do not give them complimentary upgrades just because they yell the loudest. For the last 5 years, they have treated me like the hired help simply because I do not come from generational wealth. They think their fake pedigree gives them the right to walk all over working-class people. I want to see exactly how they treat your staff when they think there are no consequences. Give them enough rope, Sterling. Let them hang themselves." Sterling allowed a small, sharp smile to touch the corners of his mouth, He understood perfectly. He turned around, opened a secure biometric safe built into the wall behind him, and pulled out a sleek, heavy-duty black tablet. He placed it on the desk and slid it across the polished wood toward me. "This is the master control terminal," Sterling explained. "It is linked directly to our central servers. Through this tablet, you have real-time access to every single operation in the resort. You can view the live financial ledger, monitor every open guest tab, access the security camera feeds, and lock or unlock any account on the property with the tap of your finger." I picked up the tablet. The screen glowed to life, displaying a highly organized dashboard of numbers, names, and property metrics. It was the ultimate weapon, and it rested lightly in the palm of my hand. I tapped the screen, navigating to the guest registry. I saw Julian's name attached to the ground floor room. I saw Vivian's name on the master suite, and I saw Trey and Chloe's names attached to the oceanfront penthouse. "Everything is perfectly in place," I murmured, my eyes scanning the live financial data streaming across the screen. My heart beat with a steady, quiet rhythm. The humiliation I had felt in the lobby was completely gone, replaced by the cold, calculating focus of a predator watching its prey wander into a trap. I looked up at Sterling, locking the tablet screen and sliding it into my designer bag. "Where are they right now?" Sterling adjusted his cuffs and looked at his own computer monitor. "They bypassed their rooms entirely and headed straight for the private pool area. They are at the luxury cabanas, ma'am, and they are already making demands." I left the cool quiet of the executive suite and made my way down the winding stone path toward the private pool. The afternoon sun was warm against my skin, and the air smelled heavily of coconut oil and sea salt. Oak Haven Estate boasted one of the most exclusive pool decks on the East Coast, featuring infinity edges that seemed to drop right off into the Atlantic Ocean. Lined along the far side of the sparkling water were 10 private luxury cabanas draped in sheer white curtains. I did not even need to look for my family. I could hear them from 50 yards away. Vivian's sharp, demanding voice cut right through the ambient sound of splashing water and acoustic tropical music. She was holding court in Cabana Number 1, which happened to be the largest and most expensive unit on the deck. As I approached the wooden steps, I saw Julian awkwardly standing near the entrance, holding 2 oversized beach towels, like a pool boy waiting for a tip. Inside the shaded cabana, Trey was sprawled completely across a cushioned lounger, scrolling mindlessly on his phone. Meanwhile, his wife Chloe was putting on a highly theatrical display of physical distress. Chloe was vigorously fanning her face with a laminated drink menu. She wore a massive floppy straw hat and an absurdly tiny white designer bikini. She was whining loudly to anyone who would listen that the ocean breeze was simply not cool enough, and that the overhead cabana fan was practically useless. She complained that the waitstaff was deliberately ignoring her, and that the ice in her water glass had melted far too quickly. It was a masterclass in manufactured victimhood. Vivian sat perfectly upright on a teakwood chair, sipping a vibrant pink cocktail. When she spotted me walking up the steps, her eyes narrowed. She immediately seized the opportunity to put me to work. "Jada." "There you are," Vivian barked, not even bothering to say hello or ask how my walk from the lobby was. "Put your bag down and make yourself useful. Chloe is absolutely parched, and the service out here today is completely unacceptable. Go find a waiter and get her a fresh bucket of ice. And do not just grab any tap water. She only drinks that specific imported Italian sparkling water. The one in the blue glass bottle. Make sure it is properly chilled." I stopped at the top of the steps and glanced at Julian. I waited for him to intervene. I waited for him to tell his mother that I had just arrived and should be allowed to sit down and relax. Instead, Julian immediately looked down at his feet, suddenly fascinated by the stitching on the beach towels. He was not going to offer to go to the bar. He was not going to defend me. He was going to stand there and let his mother treat his wife like an unpaid intern. Before I could even respond to the ridiculous demand, Vivian turned her attention to a wealthy-looking older couple occupying the neighboring cabana. She leaned over the low dividing wall, projecting her voice so that everyone in the vicinity could hear her clearly. "You have to excuse the fuss," Vivian said with a loud, artificial laugh. "My daughter-in-law, Chloe, simply has very refined standards. She grew up summering in Newport, you know. Old money, New England pedigree. Her family practically invented the country club scene out there, so she is just used to a certain level of excellence." The older couple offered polite, tight-lipped smiles, clearly uncomfortable with the unsolicited bragging. Vivian then gestured vaguely in my direction, with her half-empty cocktail glass. "Now Jada here," Vivian continued, dropping her voice into a tone of mock sympathy that was still entirely too loud. "Jada is Julian's wife. She is from a very modest working-class neighborhood down in Atlanta, so she is used to roughing it. This kind of luxury is all very new and overwhelming for her. We are just so glad Julian brought her along so she can finally see how the other half lives." Bless her heart. Chloe offered a small, tragic smile and nodded softly, as if my mere existence was a heavy charitable burden they were all bravely carrying. Trey did not even look up from his phone, but I saw the corner of his mouth twitch into a satisfied smirk. The sheer audacity of the narrative they were spinning was breathtaking. Chloe was currently living off maxed-out credit cards, and Trey was drowning in secret corporate debt. Yet here was Vivian loudly spinning a fairy tale of old-money aristocracy, while painting me as the grateful street urchin they had graciously rescued from the mud. I could have snapped right then and there. I could have loudly announced my exact net worth to the neighboring cabanas. I could have exposed Trey's bankrupt logistics business and humiliated Chloe in front of the entire pool deck. I could have kicked them all out onto the street before sunset. But that would have been entirely too fast. That would have been messy and impulsive. I wanted a clean, absolute dismantling of their fake empire. I wanted them to build their fragile house of cards as high as possible before I violently kicked the table out from underneath them. So I did not frown. I did not raise my voice or argue. I just looked at Vivian and offered a bright, impossibly sweet smile. "Of course, Vivian," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly even. "I would be happy to go fetch Chloe her special Italian sparkling water and fresh ice. Please, just relax and enjoy the ocean view. I will handle absolutely everything." Julian let out a massive sigh of relief, thinking I had simply submitted to his mother's will once again. I turned around and walked away from the cabana, feeling the heavy, curious stares of the neighboring guests burning into my back. I made my way slowly along the edge of the pool, walking past the sunbathing crowds and heading straight toward the massive outdoor tiki bar. But I had absolutely no intention of ordering sparkling water. While I was sitting in the executive suite earlier, scrolling through the live financial dashboard on my master tablet, I had noticed a very interesting anomaly attached to Trey and Chloe's past resort reservations. It was a glaring red flag in the accounting system that the previous management had been entirely too lazy or intimidated to investigate. I approached the long, polished mahogany bar counter and caught the eye of the head bartender. It was time to pull the very first thread and watch my in-laws' perfectly curated lies begin to rapidly unravel. The outdoor tiki bar was situated at the far end of the pool deck, a massive structure built from authentic reclaimed mahogany and shaded by a sprawling thatched roof. The area was packed with guests ordering colorful cocktails and expensive appetizers, completely oblivious to the quiet war I was currently waging. I bypassed the crowded front counter and walked directly to the secluded service station at the side of the bar. A young bartender with a crisp white shirt and a polished silver name tag that read David was busy wiping down the counter. I leaned against the smooth mahogany and caught his attention. "Excuse me, David," I said, keeping my voice low and pleasant. "I need you to pull up the active folio and complete billing history for the guests currently occupying the oceanfront penthouse." David stopped wiping the counter and offered a polite but firm smile. "I am very sorry, ma'am, but guest billing information is strictly confidential. If you need to settle a tab for your family, I can take your card, But I cannot show you the itemized screen. I did not argue. I simply reached into my designer bag and pulled out the heavy, secure black master tablet that Sterling had given me in the executive suite. I laid it flat on the counter right in front of him. I tapped the screen once, waking it up to display the resort's top-level administrative dashboard, a highly restricted interface that only the absolute highest-ranking personnel possessed. David looked at the screen, and his eyes widened to the size of saucers. The polite customer service smile vanished from his face, replaced by an expression of profound shock. He looked from the tablet up to my face, suddenly realizing that the woman Vivian had just been loudly belittling as a working-class charity case was actually the person signing his paychecks. "Please, go ahead and turn your point-of-sale monitor around, David," I instructed calmly. "We are going to do a little bit of forensic accounting together." David swallowed hard, nodded quickly, and unlocked his terminal. He swiveled the heavy touchscreen monitor around so it faced me directly. He typed in the suite number for the penthouse. The screen flashed, processing the request, and then instantly populated with lines of text. The entire screen was bleeding red. I leaned in closer, my eyes scanning the staggering columns of numbers. It was infinitely worse than the brief anomaly I had noticed on my tablet in Sterling's office. I began scrolling through the itemized receipts, and what I saw was a masterclass in financial fraud. There were thousands of dollars charged for private oceanfront couples massages. There were exorbitant bills for imported caviar, premium aged Wagyu beef, and daily room service breakfasts that cost more than a standard car payment. They had chartered the resort's private yacht for sunset cruises. They had raided the elite wine cellar. The total outstanding balance was astronomical. But the most shocking part was the payment method. Every single charge from this weekend, as well as the entirety of their past 3 summer vacations, was routed to a corporate billing account registered under Trey's Logistics Company. I looked up at David, pointing a manicured finger at the glowing red status indicator next to the account name. "Why is this corporate account still active in your system if it is flagged as severely delinquent for the past 18 months? David leaned in, lowering his voice as if he were afraid Trey might somehow hear him from 50 yards away. "The previous owners were absolutely terrified of him, ma'am. The account has been dead for a year and a half. The corporate platinum card on file has been repeatedly declined for insufficient funds every single time accounting tried to run it. But whenever the old front desk manager brought it up, your brother-in-law would cause a massive scene." David shook his head, looking disgusted. He used to scream at the young receptionists in the lobby. He would threaten to call his elite network of politicians and hedge fund managers to completely destroy the resort's reputation. He claimed the declined charges were just a banking error, and that he was too important to be harassed over pennies. The previous owners were bleeding money and desperate to avoid bad press, so they just let the debt roll over year after year. They were too cowardly to call his bluff, so he and his wife just kept drinking and eating for free. I stared at the red numbers on the screen, letting the magnitude of the lie wash over me. A wave of profound, icy clarity settled into my chest. The golden child was a complete deadbeat. Trey was not a highly successful chief executive officer running a lucrative logistics empire. He was a complete fraud. The man who constantly belittled Julian for not earning a high enough salary, the man Vivian proudly paraded around society events like a glittering trophy, was totally broke. He was surviving on a glitch in a failing resort's accounting software. And Chloe, the supposed heiress with her refined tastes and her old-money New England pedigree, was nothing but a grifter playing an elaborate game of dress-up. Her trust fund did not exist. Her elite status was a mirage. They were living a luxurious lie, funding their extravagant lifestyle through aggressive intimidation and stolen hospitality. The sheer hypocrisy of it all was intoxicating. I thought about Vivian sitting in that cabana, loudly mocking my working-class Atlanta roots to strangers. I thought about Julian constantly shrinking himself, bending over backward to appease a brother who was secretly drowning in massive corporate debt. I had spent the last decade building actual, tangible wealth through relentless hard work, sleepless nights, and incredibly smart commercial investments. Meanwhile, the people who looked down on me were literally stealing sparkling water from a hotel bar. I tapped the screen of the point-of-sale monitor, committing the exact dollar amount of their debt to memory. "Thank you, David," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "You have been incredibly helpful. Please return to your normal duties and remember our non-disclosure agreement." "Absolutely, ma'am," David replied instantly, swiveling his monitor back around and picking up his bar towel. I stepped away from the mahogany counter, holding my master tablet firmly against my chest. I did not head toward the cabanas with Chloe's ridiculous sparkling water. Instead, I stood in the shade of a large palm tree and looked across the sparkling blue water of the pool. Over at cabana number 1, Trey was putting on another pathetic performance. He was standing up now, leaning over the low wooden wall of the cabana to ensure the wealthy older couple next door could hear every single word he said. He flagged down a passing cabana waiter with an arrogant, snapping motion of his fingers. I watched as Trey puffed out his chest and loudly ordered a $400 bottle of vintage champagne, demanding it be brought out in a silver ice bucket immediately to combat the terrible heat. He waved his hand dismissively at the waiter, telling the young man to just put the ridiculous charge on his usual corporate tab. The waiter nodded respectfully, completely unaware of the financial black hole he was dealing with, and turned to walk toward the bar to fulfill the order. I did not move a muscle. I simply looked down at the glowing screen of my tablet. I navigated through the secure administrative menus until I found the specific, active corporate profile linked to the oceanfront penthouse. I stared at Trey's name for a fraction of a second. Then, with a single deliberate tap of my finger, I permanently locked the account. I stepped away from the shade of the palm tree and walked over to a nearby self-service water station. I completely ignored Vivian's strict instructions to fetch the expensive imported Italian sparkling water. Instead, I grabbed a standard plastic pitcher, filled it with regular tap water, and scooped some rapidly melting ice into a basic metal bucket. I balanced the pitcher and the bucket in my hands and began the walk back to cabana number 1. The sun was beating down, but I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, calculated thrill. When I stepped up into the shaded cabana, the atmosphere was thick with entitlement. I placed the plastic pitcher of tap water and the basic ice bucket directly onto the teakwood coffee table right in front of Chloe. The heavy thud of the pitcher caused everyone to look up. Chloe pulled down her oversized sunglasses and stared at the plastic pitcher as if I had just placed a live snake on the table. She looked from the tap water up to my face, her lips pressing into a thin, disappointed line. She let out a dramatic, breathy sigh. "Jada, I thought Vivian was very clear," Chloe said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "I specifically asked for the blue glass bottle. The imported one. My stomach is incredibly sensitive to the harsh minerals in regular tap water. Honestly, it is like you are not even trying to be helpful." Vivian shook her head in disgust, taking another sip of her pink cocktail. "You cannot teach elegance, Chloe," Vivian muttered loudly. "Some people are just aggressively committed to mediocrity." I just offered a polite, vacant smile and took a step back, standing near the entrance of the cabana. I figured that would be the end of it, but Chloe was apparently feeling emboldened by Vivian's support. She sat up slightly on her cushioned lounger, resting her chin on her hand, and decided to shift her attack from my competence to my physical appearance. Her eyes scanned my face and then landed deliberately on my hair. I was wearing my hair in its natural state, a full, beautiful wash and go that I had perfected over the years. "You know, Jada," Chloe began, tilting her head to the side like a concerned friend, "the humidity out here is just doing absolute a number on your hair. It is getting so incredibly big and unruly." She gestured vaguely around the pristine pool deck, pointing toward the other wealthy guests, who all looked meticulously styled. "This resort has a very specific aesthetic. It is very polished, very sleek. Old money elegance. Your hair just looks a little too unkempt for a place like this. Do you not have a silk scarf? Or maybe a large hat you could put on to just smooth everything down?" It just does not really fit the vibe we are going for today. The sheer audacity of her microaggression hung heavily in the humid air. She was a broke woman living on stolen credit, sitting under a cabana I legally owned, telling me that my natural black hair did not fit the aesthetic of my own multi-million-dollar property. I slowly turned my head to look at Julian. This was his family. This was his sister-in-law openly disrespecting his wife's natural features in public. I waited for the flash of anger in his eyes. I waited for him to finally step between us, to tell Chloe she had crossed a serious line, and to demand respect for his wife. But Julian simply looked stressed. He rubbed the back of his neck, completely avoiding my gaze. He let out a nervous chuckle and stepped closer to me, lowering his voice into a harsh whisper. "Come on, Jada," Julian muttered. "Do not look at me like that. Chloe is just trying to help you fit in. You know my mother wants to take family photos by the pool later, and we all need to look presentable. Just go back to the room and tie it back or put some gel on it. Please do not start a fight and embarrass us in front of all these important people. Just go fix it." He was asking me to shrink myself. He was asking me to literally alter my physical appearance so that his fake aristocratic family could feel more comfortable. 5 years of this exact behavior flashed before my eyes. 5 years of swallowing my pride to keep the peace for a man who would not even stand up for me against a passive-aggressive comment about my hair. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or defend the beauty of my natural hair. I did not need to. I looked at Julian and then looked over at Chloe. "You are right, Chloe," I said, my voice incredibly soft and agreeable. "I would hate to ruin the old money aesthetic of your vacation." I reached into my designer bag and pulled out my smartphone. While I had already initiated the freeze on my master tablet at the bar, I needed to ensure the command had fully propagated through the resort's entire point-of-sale network. I opened the secure management application linked directly to the main server. I navigated to the corporate account registered under Trey's logistics company. The screen displayed the outstanding $45,000 balance in bright red text. Below it was a toggle switch labeled Account Status. With a serene smile on my face, I swiped my thumb across the screen. The toggle flipped. A heavy red lock icon appeared on my phone, confirming that the corporate account was now completely frozen across every single register, restaurant, and service desk on the entire property. They were officially cut off. I slipped my phone back into my bag and folded my hands neatly in front of me. "I am just going to stay right here," I announced brightly. "I want to enjoy the view." Julian groaned quietly, turning his back to me in frustration, while Chloe rolled her eyes and went back to fanning herself with the menu. But my attention was no longer on them. I was watching the paved walkway leading from the tiki bar toward our cabana. A young waiter dressed in the resort's crisp white uniform was making his way toward us. He was the same waiter Trey had aggressively ordered the $400 bottle of vintage champagne from just moments ago. However, the waiter was not carrying a silver ice bucket. He was not carrying any champagne flutes. He was walking entirely empty-handed, save for a small black leather receipt folio clutched tightly to his chest. The waiter stepped up to the edge of the cabana, looking incredibly nervous. He cleared his throat, trying to get Trey's attention. "Excuse me, sir." Trey finally looked up from his phone, a scowl immediately forming on his face. "Where is the champagne I ordered? I told you I wanted it immediately. Do you know how much money I spend at this place?" The waiter swallowed hard and opened the black leather folio. "I am so sorry, sir," the waiter stammered, keeping his voice as polite as possible. "I tried to run the authorization for the bottle, but the system is returning an error. It says your corporate account has been permanently frozen by executive management. The system will not allow me to process any further charges to this profile." The cabana went dead silent. The acoustic music playing in the background suddenly seemed incredibly loud. Trey lowered his phone, his confident scowl melting into an expression of sheer confusion. "What did you just say?" "I am sorry, sir," the waiter repeated, stepping back slightly. "The account is locked. If you would like the champagne, I will need a personal credit card to cover the $400 charge, as well as authorization to settle the outstanding balance on the frozen account. Trey's face began to flush a deep, angry red. He stood up abruptly, the wooden chair scraping violently against the cabana floor. He looked at the waiter, then looked over at Vivian, his carefully constructed illusion of wealth suddenly cracking wide open for the very first time. Trey spent the rest of the afternoon frantically pacing the perimeter of the pool deck, his phone practically glued to his ear. When he finally returned to the cabana, he was sweating profusely, and his signature arrogance had completely evaporated. He spun a desperate, convoluted lie for Vivian and Chloe, claiming that his corporate accounting team had simply flagged the resort charges as suspected fraud because he was spending so much money so quickly. He assured them the bank would have it sorted out by Monday morning, and he casually canceled the vintage champagne order, claiming the heat had suddenly ruined his appetite for alcohol anyway. Vivian swallowed the lie without hesitation, completely eager to protect the illusion of her successful golden child. But I saw the panic in his eyes. He knew the walls were closing in. Fast forward to 8 o'clock that evening. The ocean breeze had cooled the island, and the sky was painted in deep strokes of violet and gold. It was time for Vivian's highly anticipated annual private family dinner. The table was set on the resort's exclusive upper terrace, an intimate outdoor dining space reserved solely for VIP guests. A massive mahogany table sat under a canopy of interwoven vines and delicate fairy lights. The view of the Atlantic Ocean from up there was absolutely breathtaking. It was the kind of setting that demanded elegance and grace. Naturally, my in-laws brought nothing but complaints and hostility. The resort was operating at absolute peak capacity for the summer weekend, and the waitstaff was visibly stretched thin. Our dedicated server had already apologized for a slight delay in bringing out the first course. For a normal family, a 10-minute wait on a beautiful terrace overlooking the ocean with a glass of wine would be a blessing. For Vivian, it was an unforgivable crime. She sat at the head of the table, tapping her manicured fingernails aggressively against the polished wood. "This is simply unacceptable," Vivian announced, her voice cutting through the ambient sound of the crashing waves. "We are paying top dollar for this private dining experience, and they are treating us like second-class citizens at a diner. I should have the general manager fire the entire dining room staff tonight." Chloe sighed dramatically and swirled the water in her glass. "I know, Vivian. It is so hard to find good help these days. Nobody wants to actually work anymore." I sat quietly next to Julian, sipping my water and observing the absolute hypocrisy. Chloe was complaining about people not wanting to work while simultaneously living entirely off stolen money. Trey was staring blankly at his empty plate, looking slightly nauseous. Vivian suddenly stopped tapping her nails and turned her sharp gaze directly toward me. A cruel spark lit up in her eyes as a new idea formed in her mind. "Jada," Vivian said, her tone suddenly loud and authoritative. "Since the staff here is clearly incompetent, you need to go down to the kitchen and help them expedite our meal. Go make yourself useful." Julian shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Ma, come on," Julian muttered weakly. "Jada is dressed for dinner. She cannot go into the kitchen." "She absolutely can," Vivian shot back, her voice dripping with venom. "Do not act like she is too good for it, Julian. We all know Jada knows her way around a kitchen far better than she will ever know her way around a boardroom. Growing up the way she did, she is probably much more comfortable back there with the staff than she is sitting out here with us anyway. Go on, Jada. Tell them table 4 is waiting." Chloe let out a sharp, mocking snicker, quickly covering her mouth with her napkin. Trey actually smirked, finding a momentary distraction from his own impending financial ruin. I looked at Julian. Once again, the floor was entirely his. He could have told his mother that her comment was classless and unacceptable. He could have reminded her that his wife was the founder of an investment firm. He could have stood up and demanded respect. But Julian simply looked down at his lap, picked up his fork, and began tracing invisible lines on the tablecloth. His silence was deafening. It was the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. I did not let the anger show on my face. I simply placed my linen napkin on the table and stood up, smoothing the front of my silk evening gown. "You are entirely right, Vivian," I said softly. "I do know exactly how a kitchen is supposed to be run. I will go check on our food right now." I turned away from the table and walked confidently across the terrace, leaving the sound of their smug laughter behind me. I pushed through the heavy double-swinging doors that led directly into the heart of the resort's main culinary operation. The moment the doors closed behind me, the sensory environment completely shifted. The quiet elegance of the terrace was replaced by the roaring, high-stakes energy of a commercial kitchen during the dinner rush. The air was thick with the smell of roasting garlic, seared steaks, and fresh herbs. Stainless steel pans clattered against industrial stoves. The shouts of the line cooks calling out orders echoed over the hiss of open flames. It was chaotic, but to my trained eye, it was a perfectly orchestrated symphony. I did not step out of the way like a lost guest. I stood near the main pass and activated my investor mindset. I was conducting a live, unannounced audit of my own asset. I watched the executive chef, a brilliant culinary mind I had personally reviewed the contract for last week, conducting the flow of food with military precision. I checked the digital ticket times flashing on the monitors overhead. Despite the heavy volume of guests, the kitchen was running incredibly efficiently. The delay Vivian had complained about was entirely standard for a scratch kitchen producing gourmet meals. I observed the sanitation practices, the communication between the sous chefs, and the overall morale of the back-of-house staff. Everything was operating exactly as my firm had mandated during the takeover. The previous owners had let this kitchen fall into disrepair, but the infusion of my capital had clearly revitalized the entire operation. The executive chef spotted me standing near the prep station. Because of the strict non-disclosure agreement, he did not address me as his boss. He simply gave me a polite, questioning look, assuming I was a highly demanding VIP guest who had wandered too far. I offered him a warm, respectful nod, signaling that I was not there to cause trouble. Right at that moment, a young prep cook brought a massive, heavy crystal bowl up to the pass. It was the extravagant family-style salad Vivian had pre-ordered for our table. The chef carefully garnished it with fresh microgreens and wiped the rim of the crystal clean with a towel. He rang the service bell, signaling for a waiter to run the dish out to the terrace. I stepped forward and gently placed my hand on the cool crystal edge of the bowl before the waiter could reach it. "I will take this one out to table 4 myself," I told the waiter, keeping my voice pleasant but leaving absolutely no room for argument. The waiter looked slightly confused, but he was too busy to argue with a guest in a designer gown who wanted to carry her own food. He simply nodded and moved on to the next ticket. I picked up the heavy crystal bowl, balancing it carefully in my hands. The chilled glass felt solid and grounding against my palms. I took a deep breath, inhaling the sharp scent of the kitchen one last time. The audit was officially complete. The resort was functioning flawlessly. The trap had been perfectly set, and my in-laws had gleefully walked right into the center of it. I turned around and pushed my way back through the swinging doors, stepping out into the cool evening air of the terrace. I walked slowly and deliberately toward the mahogany table where Vivian sat waiting, perfectly positioning myself to bring this entire 5-year charade to a brutal and satisfying end. I stepped back out onto the terrace, the heavy crystal salad bowl resting perfectly balanced in my hands. The evening breeze caught the edge of my silk evening gown, but my footing was absolutely solid. As I approached the mahogany dining table under the fairy lights, the conversation immediately stopped. Vivian looked up, her eyes dropping from my face to the bowl I was carrying. A look of supreme satisfaction washed over her features. She had finally put me in her intended place. In her mind, she had successfully reduced the independent, successful woman her son had married into nothing more than an unpaid servant serving her dinner. I walked to the head of the table. Chloe leaned back in her chair, offering a smug, tight-lipped smile as she smoothed her linen napkin over her lap. Trey did not even bother to look up, too busy aggressively tapping at his phone screen, still clearly panicking over his frozen corporate account. Julian kept his eyes glued to his water glass, his shoulders hunched in shame, completely surrendering his role as my husband. I placed the heavy crystal salad bowl onto the mahogany dining table, the glass clinking sharply against the polished wood. The sound rang out like a bell marking the end of a long, exhausting war. My mother-in-law Vivian did not even blink. She just took a slow, deliberate sip of her expensive chardonnay, looking right through me as if I were completely invisible. "The help does not eat with family, Jada," Vivian said, her voice dripping with casual cruelty. "You can go fix yourself a plate in the kitchen." The air on the terrace grew incredibly still. 5 years of biting my tongue, 5 years of smiling through the insults, 5 years of shrinking myself to fit into their narrow, hateful worldview, all came down to this exact fraction of a second. I did not flinch. I did not cry. I did not storm off in a fit of rage like they desperately wanted me to. Instead, I simply smiled. I leaned forward, resting my manicured hands flat on the edge of the mahogany table, and looked her straight in the eye. "Actually, Vivian," I said, my voice smooth, loud, and carrying absolute authority, "I own this resort." For a long, suspended moment, there was nothing but dead silence. The only sound was the crashing of the ocean waves against the cliffs far below. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Vivian lowered her wine glass slowly, her heavily powdered forehead wrinkling in deep confusion. Then the denial set in. Chloe broke the silence first. She let out a sudden, high-pitched giggle that sounded like a hiccup. She slapped her hand over her chest, looking around the table with wide, amused eyes. "Oh my gosh, Jada," Chloe breathed out, her fake refined accent slipping entirely. "That is literally the most pathetic joke I have ever heard in my entire life. You are being so embarrassing right now. Please just stop talking." Trey scoffed loudly, tossing his phone onto the table with a clatter. He leaned back and crossed his arms over his chest, looking at me with pure disgust. "You are completely delusional," he spat, his voice laced with the nervous energy he had been carrying since the pool deck. "You could not afford to buy a timeshare in a roadside motel, let alone a multi-million-dollar luxury estate. You are making an absolute fool of yourself. Did the heat fry your brain while you were walking from the lobby? Go back to your room before I have security throw you out." He was projecting his own monumental financial failure onto me, desperately trying to reassert his dominance before his own lies were dragged into the light. But the most damning reaction did not come from Chloe or Trey. It came from the man sitting directly to my right. Julian suddenly shot up from his chair. His face was pale and slick with nervous sweat. He was absolutely terrified of his mother's wrath, terrified that my behavior was going to ruin his standing in the family forever. He reached out and physically grabbed my arm. His fingers dug painfully into my skin. "What is wrong with you?" Julian hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. "Stop making a scene. You are ruining the entire weekend. Just apologize to my mother right now and go back to our basement room. Do not come out until I tell you to." I looked down at his hand wrapped tightly around my arm. I felt a cold, hollow sensation in my chest, but it was not heartbreak. It was finality. This was the man I had promised to build a life with. This was the man who was supposed to protect me, to stand by my side against any storm. And here he was, actively participating in my abuse, trying to drag me down into the dark so his toxic family could continue to shine. I did not need him anymore. I did not need any of them. I looked from his trembling hand up to his panicked eyes. The pleasant, accommodating smile I had worn for 5 years vanished completely. I ripped my arm out of his grasp with such sudden, aggressive force that Julian actually stumbled backward, hitting the edge of his dining chair. "I am not going to the basement, Julian," I said, my voice ringing out across the quiet terrace like a crack of thunder. And neither are you. The silence that followed my declaration was entirely shattered by the violent scraping of wood against stone. Vivian shot up from her chair with such sudden force that her water glass tipped over, spilling ice and water all over the expensive linen tablecloth. Her face had shifted from its usual heavily powdered pale complexion to a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. She was absolutely trembling with pure, unadulterated rage. I had just publicly humiliated her golden child, physically rejected her youngest son, and claimed ownership of the very ground she stood on. In her eyes, I had committed the ultimate, unforgivable sin. "How absolutely dare you," Vivian hissed, her voice vibrating with a fury so intense it drew the attention of every single diner on the terrace. "How dare you speak to my son that way? And how dare you stand here and tell such a pathetic, delusional lie in public? You are nothing but a common street girl who got lucky that Julian had a bleeding heart. You do not own anything. You are having a psychotic break, and you are ruining my family dinner." Chloe quickly leaned away from the table, clutching her chest as if she were in physical danger. "Oh my gosh, she is completely unhinged," Chloe whispered loudly to Trey. "She actually needs to be committed. She is going to hurt someone." Trey puffed out his chest, stepping forward to stand next to Vivian, eager to play the protector now that he had a distraction from his frozen credit cards. "Watch your mouth," Jada Trey barked, pointing a finger directly at my face. "You are completely out of your mind. You need to pack your cheap bags and get off this island before I call the police myself." But Vivian was not going to let Trey handle it. She wanted the absolute pleasure of destroying me herself. She snatched her designer handbag off the back of her chair and aggressively rummaged through it until she pulled out her smartphone. She held it up like a weapon, her manicured thumb hovering over the screen. "I am not calling the police," Vivian announced, her voice echoing across the quiet dining area. "I am calling the executive management group. I have been coming to this resort for 15 years. I personally know the board of directors. I know the investors. I spend tens of thousands of dollars here every single summer. I am going to have them send the absolute largest security guards they have up to this terrace right now." She looked me up and down with an expression of pure disgust, detailing exactly how she planned to end my night. "I am going to have you physically removed from this property, Jada. I am going to have them drag you through the lobby in front of everyone, charge you with trespassing, and have you permanently banned from the entire island. You can sleep on the side of the road for all I care. You are done. You are completely finished in this family." Julian let out a miserable, pathetic groan. He buried his face in his hands, resting his elbows on his knees, completely surrendering to the chaos. He did not say a single word to defend me. He did not ask his mother to put the phone down. He just sat there, waiting for the storm to pass so he could go back to being a subservient little boy. Vivian furiously tapped the screen of her phone, navigating to her contacts list, desperately searching for a number she had probably saved a decade ago. The entire table watched her, fully expecting me to suddenly break down, to fall to my knees and beg for forgiveness, to admit that it was all a terrible joke and plead for her to let me stay. I did absolutely none of those things. I stepped closer to the mahogany table, completely ignoring the phone waving in my face. I reached out and picked up the heavy, chilled bottle of premium chardonnay that Vivian had ordered for herself. I picked up an empty crystal wine glass from the center of the table. With slow, deliberate precision, I poured myself a generous glass of the expensive white wine. The sound of the liquid filling the crystal was the only thing that could be heard over the crashing waves below. I set the bottle back down, raised the glass to my lips, and took a long, incredibly satisfying sip. The wine was crisp, cold, and tasted remarkably like absolute victory. I lowered the glass and looked directly into Vivian's furious eyes. "Put the phone away, Vivian," I said, my voice dangerously calm and laced with absolute authority. "Do not bother calling the front desk. The people you think you know do not own this property anymore. I bought them out 3 weeks ago, completely in cash. But if you want to speak to the general manager so badly, you do not need to call him. I placed the crystal glass gently onto the table, adjusting my silk evening gown. I will walk down to the lobby with you right now, I challenged, holding my hand out toward the terrace exit. Let us go see exactly who gets escorted off my property by security. Let us go see exactly who is trespassing. Vivian stared at me, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and blinding anger. She genuinely believed I was bluffing. She genuinely believed that I was a poor, desperate woman trying to put on a brave face before the inevitable humiliation. She snapped her phone shut and shoved it back into her designer bag, her lips curling into a cruel, triumphant sneer. Fine, Vivian spat out, her voice dripping with venom. If you want to do this the hard way, if you want to be completely humiliated in front of the entire resort, I will gladly oblige. Let us go to the lobby. She turned on her heel, her expensive shoes clicking aggressively against the stone floor of the terrace, and began marching toward the exit. She walked with the absolute confidence of a woman who had never been told no in her entire life, a woman who believed her fake pedigree was an impenetrable shield. Trey and Chloe immediately scrambled out of their chairs to follow her. Chloe looked at me and shook her head, letting out a dramatic sigh of pity before grabbing Trey's arm. Trey simply sneered at me, completely eager to watch my supposed downfall, hoping it would somehow magically erase his own massive financial failures. Julian was the last to stand up. He looked at me, his eyes red and pleading. "Jada, please," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Just stop. Just go back to the room. I will try to talk her down. Do not do this." I looked at the man I had married, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, heavy indifference. "You do not get to talk anyone down, Julian," I replied softly. "Now start walking. You do not want to keep your mother waiting." Julian flinched as if I had physically struck him. He dropped his head, turned around, and began trailing pathetically behind his brother and sister-in-law. I stood alone by the mahogany table for one final moment. I took a deep breath of the cool ocean air, letting the absolute certainty of what was about to happen settle into my veins. Then, with my head held high and my posture perfectly straight, I followed my toxic in-laws off the terrace. The entire family was marching toward the grand lobby, completely eager and fully expecting to watch me get thrown out into the dark night. They had absolutely no idea they were walking directly to their own execution. The walk from the upper terrace down to the main lobby felt like a bizarre and highly dramatic royal procession. Vivian marched at the very front of the pack with her chin held high and her expensive silk evening gown flowing behind her like a cape. She was not walking like a woman who had just been deeply insulted at dinner. She was walking like a queen who was about to publicly execute a traitor for treason. The resort was beautifully illuminated at night with antique gas lanterns, casting a warm, romantic glow over the manicured gardens. But Vivian was absolutely determined to cast a dark and ugly shadow over the entire evening. As we descended the wide stone staircase leading toward the indoor promenade, Vivian officially began her performance. She did not bother to keep her voice down. In fact, she intentionally projected her voice so that every single guest we passed on the pathways could hear her twisted version of events. "Can you believe the absolute audacity?" Vivian said loudly over her shoulder to Chloe, intentionally making sure a group of older, wealthy gentlemen smoking cigars near the railing overheard her. Bringing a girl from the slums into a prestigious place like this, only for her to have a complete mental breakdown and threaten us at the dinner table. I always told Julian that marrying down would completely ruin his reputation in polite society. Now we have to involve hotel security just to enjoy our vacation in peace. Chloe nodded eagerly, playing her part as the delicate victim to absolute perfection. She clutched her small designer purse tightly to her chest and let out a dramatic, trembling sigh. "I am just so incredibly shaken up," Chloe replied, her voice wavering with fake anxiety. The way she looked at us back there was honestly terrifying, Trey. I do not feel safe with her sleeping on the same island as us tonight. Trey wrapped a heavy protective arm around his wife's shoulders, completely leaning into his role as the wealthy and rugged defender of the family. "Do not worry about a thing," Babe Trey said, puffing out his chest and glaring back at me over his shoulder. "I am not going to let this crazy woman get anywhere near you again. Once executive management gets a hold of her, she will be incredibly lucky if they do not press criminal charges. I know the local police chief out here anyway. One quick phone call from me and she will be sitting in a dirty holding cell before midnight." It was a truly fascinating display of collective delusion. Trey did not know the local police chief. Trey barely knew how to pay his own electric bill without dipping into corporate funds at this point. But they were all aggressively feeding off each other's lies, building a massive fortress of fake superiority to shield themselves from the devastating reality I had just dropped on their dinner table. I walked about 5 paces behind them, my posture completely relaxed and my breathing steady. I did not look angry, and I certainly did not look crazy. I simply watched them with the mild, detached curiosity of a scientist observing a group of panicked insects trapped in a glass jar. And then there was Julian. My husband was walking another 10 paces behind me, dragging his feet across the stone tiles like a condemned man walking to the gallows. He was sweating heavily through his crisp shirt, his face pale and contorted with deep humiliation. Whenever we passed other resort guests, Julian would physically shrink into himself, ducking his head and pretending to be fascinated by his watch or the stitching on his shoes. He wanted absolutely nothing to do with this public confrontation. He was terrified of his mother, he was terrified of his older brother, and suddenly, he was deeply terrified of me. He had spent the last 5 years demanding that I constantly compromise my own dignity just to keep the peace in his family. Now that the peace was permanently broken, he had absolutely no idea how to function. He was a hollow shell of a man, and as I listened to his nervous footsteps behind me, I felt nothing but a profound sense of relief that I was finally cutting him out of my life forever. We passed through the heavy glass double doors separating the outdoor tropical gardens from the grand indoor promenade. The central air conditioning washed over us, cool and crisp, instantly cutting through the humid night air. The string quartet that had been playing earlier in the afternoon was currently taking a break, which meant the expansive marble-floored room was relatively quiet. Only the soft murmur of conversations from the nearby cocktail lounge drifted through the space. Vivian shattered that luxurious quiet the very moment her expensive heels hit the polished marble floor. She did not calmly walk to the concierge desk. She stormed it like a military objective. The young woman working behind the counter, dressed impeccably in the Oak Haven estate uniform, looked up with a polite and welcoming smile. That professional smile instantly vanished when she saw the look of pure, unadulterated murder on Vivian's face. Vivian marched right up to the polished stone counter and slammed the flat of her hand down with a loud, aggressive crack that echoed off the high, vaulted ceilings. "I need the general manager out here this exact second," Vivian demanded, her voice shrill and echoing across the entire lobby. Several guests sitting in the nearby velvet lounge chairs immediately stopped their conversations and turned around to stare at the commotion. The young receptionist blinked, clearly taken aback by the sudden extreme hostility. "I am very sorry, ma'am," the receptionist said politely, fighting to keep her professional composure intact. "Mr. Sterling is currently in his office. Is there a medical emergency or a security issue I can assist you with right now?" "Do I look like I want to speak to a front desk receptionist?" Vivian snapped, leaning aggressively over the marble counter and pointing a sharp, manicured fingernail right at the poor girl's face. "My name is Vivian Spencer. I am a very close personal friend of the executive board that owns this entire property. I have a highly unstable and aggressive trespasser currently stalking my family, and I want her removed from the premises immediately. If you do not go get the general manager out here right now, I will personally ensure that you are standing in the unemployment line by Monday morning." Chloe stepped up right next to Vivian, crossing her arms tightly and shaking her head in disgust. "This is supposed to be an exclusive luxury resort," Chloe added, pitching her voice louder so the wealthy guests watching from the lounge could hear her clearly. "We pay entirely too much money to have to deal with this kind of danger. Please hurry up and call someone." The receptionist looked past Vivian and Chloe, her eyes scanning the lobby until they landed directly on me. I was standing calmly in the very center of the grand lobby, my hands folded loosely in front of my silk evening gown. I offered the young woman a very subtle, reassuring nod. The receptionist seemed to recognize me instantly from the strict, confidential staff briefing Sterling had conducted earlier in the week, though she brilliantly maintained her perfect poker face. "Right away, ma'am," the receptionist said to Vivian, her tone shifting to crisp efficiency. "Let me go fetch Mr. Sterling for you immediately." The receptionist picked up the heavy black landline phone on her desk, pressed a single speed dial button, and spoke very quietly into the receiver. Vivian turned around to face me, a look of absolute, triumphant vindication shining brightly in her eyes. "You pushed it way too far this time," Jada, Vivian said, her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. "You thought you could just make up some ridiculous, psychotic lie about owning this place to embarrass us, but all you did was dig your own grave. You are about to learn exactly what happens when classless people like you try to mess with powerful people like us." Trey chuckled darkly, shaking his head and checking his luxury watch. "I almost feel genuinely sorry for her," Trey muttered, sliding his hands casually into his pockets. Almost. Julian had finally caught up to the group, but he absolutely refused to step fully onto the main lobby floor. He hovered near the entrance of the promenade, hiding behind a large potted decorative palm tree, literally cowering in the shadows while his mother and brother prepared to throw his wife to the wolves. I did not say a single word in my defense. I did not need to explain myself to them. I just stood there perfectly still on the gleaming marble floor, feeling the heavy stares of the other resort guests burning into my back, calmly waiting for the final act of this pathetic play to officially commence. We did not have to wait very long at all. The heavy, solid oak doors of the executive suite, located just behind the concierge desk, suddenly clicked open. The sound was heavy and definitive in the quiet lobby. Sterling stepped out from the back office. He looked absolutely immaculate in his tailored navy suit, his posture perfectly straight, and his expression completely unreadable and strictly professional. But he was not walking out alone. Flanking him closely on either side were two massive, highly trained security guards dressed in crisp black suits. They moved with quiet, imposing authority, their eyes scanning the room as they came to a halt just behind Sterling at the front desk. The moment Vivian saw the large security guards arrive, her eyes lit up with pure malicious joy. She genuinely believed she had won. She turned toward Sterling, throwing her shoulders back and assuming the proud posture of a reigning monarch addressing her loyal subjects. "It is about time you got out here," Vivian declared loudly. She did not even wait for Sterling to introduce himself, and she did not wait for him to ask what the problem was. She simply raised her arm, extended a perfectly manicured finger, and pointed it right at my face. "That woman right there," Vivian shouted, her manicured finger trembling with absolute rage as she pointed directly at my face. "Sterling, thank goodness you are finally here. I demand that you have your security team remove her from the lobby immediately. She has been harassing my family, causing a massive disturbance at dinner, and making completely psychotic claims about owning this property. I want her bags packed, and I want her thrown off the island tonight. Do you understand me?" Vivian stood tall, her chest heaving with exertion, waiting for the general manager to jump to her command. She waited for the security guards to rush past her, grab my arms, and drag me out into the humid night. She waited for her ultimate victory. But Sterling did not move a muscle toward me in anger. He did not signal his security team. In fact, he did not even look at Vivian. Sterling completely ignored the screaming woman standing in front of his desk. He stepped around the marble counter, his polished shoes clicking softly against the floor. The two massive security guards moved in perfect, disciplined synchronization behind him, parting the space and creating a clear, unobstructed path directly to me. Vivian lowered her arm slightly, her face contorting in confusion as Sterling walked right past her. "Excuse me," Vivian snapped, turning around to follow his movements. "I am speaking to you." Sterling stopped exactly 3 feet in front of me. He completely ignored Vivian's screeching voice behind him. He adjusted his tailored navy suit jacket, clasped his hands respectfully in front of him, and bowed his head just a fraction of an inch in a display of profound professional deference. "Good evening, Ms. Jackson," Sterling said, his deep voice carrying clearly across the dead silent lobby. "Are these guests bothering you? Would you like me to have them escorted off your property?" The entire world simply stopped spinning. If a bomb had gone off in the center of the room, it would have been less destructive than those 3 simple sentences. The sheer magnitude of the shockwave that ripped through my in-laws was a physical, tangible thing. The ambient noise of the lobby completely vanished. The distant chatter from the cocktail lounge seemed to instantly evaporate. There was nothing left in the massive room but the crushing, suffocating weight of absolute reality crashing down on their heads. Vivian's mouth fell open. Her jaw literally dropped, her lips parting as the air rushed out of her lungs in a sharp, painful gasp. The hand that had been pointing at me just moments ago fell limply to her side like a heavy stone. The arrogant, untouchable matriarch of the family looked as though she had just been physically struck by lightning. Her eyes darted frantically from Sterling's respectful posture to the massive security guards waiting for my command, and finally to my completely calm, unbothered face. The invisible armor of her fake pedigree shattered into a million irreparable pieces across the marble floor. Her supposed connections to the executive board were entirely worthless. The people she thought she knew did not own the resort anymore. I did. Next to her, Chloe underwent a terrifying transformation. The smug, condescending smirk that had been permanently glued to her face all afternoon completely vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. She took a sudden, unsteady step backward, her expensive designer heels wobbling beneath her. She clutched her small purse to her chest, as if it could somehow protect her from the consequences of her own actions. Just hours ago, she had sat under a luxury cabana that I owned, drinking water from a glass that I paid for, and had the absolute audacity to tell me that my natural hair did not fit the aesthetic of my own multi-million-dollar investment. Now, looking at the general manager of the estate bowing his head to me, Chloe realized she had just severely insulted the only person standing between her and total financial ruin. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking sickly and pale under the grand chandeliers. Trey had an entirely different reaction. The alpha male bravado he had been aggressively projecting all day instantly collapsed. He stepped back, his broad shoulders suddenly slumping as if an invisible weight had been dropped directly onto his spine. His eyes widened in sheer panic. The gears in his head were violently turning, rapidly connecting the dots of the afternoon's disasters. The declined credit cards, the permanently frozen corporate account, the sudden, inexplicable lockout from the resort's charging system. He looked at the heavy black master tablet I had casually pulled out of my designer bag at the tiki bar earlier. He finally understood. It was not a banking error. It was not a glitch in the system. It was me. I had cut the cord on his lavish, stolen lifestyle with a single swipe of my finger. Trey opened his mouth to speak, to try and spin another lie, to try and salvage his dignity, but absolutely no sound came out. He was completely paralyzed by the realization that the woman he had just called a delusional, classless street girl was actually the architect of his impending destruction. I let the silence stretch out. I let them marinate in the agonizing, humiliating truth. 5 years. 5 long years of sitting quietly at dinner tables while they made jokes at my expense. 5 years of swallowing my pride while Vivian treated me like an unpaid servant. 5 years of watching Chloe look down her nose at my working-class background. 5 years of watching Trey flaunt wealth he did not even possess while calling my legitimate business investments a stupid pipe dream. All of it led to this exact second. I looked at Sterling and offered a warm, genuine smile. "Thank you, Sterling," I replied, my voice smooth and totally devoid of the frantic anxiety that was currently choking my in-laws. "I appreciate your swift response. I am perfectly fine for now. I just wanted to bring my guests down here to clarify a few administrative misunderstandings regarding the ownership of Oak Haven Estate." Sterling nodded respectfully, stepping back slightly but keeping his security guards firmly in place. "Of course, ma'am. We are entirely at your disposal." I turned my attention back to Vivian. She looked absolutely pathetic. The Grand Queen of High Society was currently trembling in her expensive silk dress, entirely stripped of her power. "You were saying something about having me thrown out, Vivian," I asked, tilting my head slightly. "You were saying something about calling your close personal friends on the executive board. Please go right ahead. Sterling can dial the number for you if you have forgotten it." Vivian swallowed hard, her throat bobbing visibly. She could not look me in the eye. She stared at the marble floor, completely unable to form a coherent sentence. The realization that the maid she had been ordering around all weekend was actually the boss had completely broken her brain. But the silence was suddenly broken by a frantic scrambling sound coming from the edge of the lobby. Julian, who had been hiding like a coward behind the large potted palm tree near the entrance of the promenade, suddenly burst out of the shadows. He had watched the entire interaction unfold. He had seen Sterling bow to me. He had seen the security guards waiting for my orders. He had watched his mother, his brother, and his sister-in-law get completely destroyed in the span of 30 seconds. But Julian did not look horrified. He did not look ashamed that he had failed to defend his wife when his family was actively trying to get her arrested. As he pushed his way to the front of the group, sprinting across the marble floor toward me, the deep humiliation that had been written all over his face just moments ago was entirely gone. It was instantly replaced by a wide, manic look of greedy excitement. Julian practically sprinted across the polished marble floor. The coward who had just spent the last 10 minutes hiding behind a potted decorative palm tree while his mother tried to have me arrested was suddenly standing tall. His eyes were wide with a feverish, greedy light. He completely ignored the devastating shock paralyzing his mother, and he entirely ignored the terrified trembling of his sister-in-law. He saw only the ultimate prize. He saw money, he saw status, and he saw a massive, unexpected victory that he desperately wanted to claim as his own. He reached out as he approached me, throwing a heavy arm around my shoulders, attempting to pull me into a tight, affectionate embrace in front of the entire lobby. "Baby, this is absolutely incredible," Julian said, his voice loud and practically vibrating with forced joy. "I cannot believe you pulled this off. Why did you not tell me we bought a luxury resort? This is exactly the kind of massive power move our family needed. We are going to completely run this island." I did not lean into his embrace. I did not smile back. I felt his sweaty palm gripping my shoulder, and I felt nothing but absolute, overwhelming revulsion. With a swift, forceful movement, I shoved his arm off my body and took 2 large steps backward. The sudden, aggressive physical rejection completely threw him off balance. His fake, enthusiastic smile faltered instantly, replaced by a look of sheer confusion. "Do not touch me, Julian," I said, my voice cold and hard as the stone floor beneath our feet. "And do not ever use the word we when you talk about my business. There is absolutely no we in this acquisition." Julian let out a nervous chuckle, holding his hands up defensively. He glanced quickly over his shoulder at the small crowd of wealthy guests who had gathered near the lounge to watch the drama unfold, suddenly highly aware of his public image. "Come on, baby," Julian stammered, his tone shifting into a pleading whisper. "I am your husband. What is yours is mine. We are a team. Do not do this right now in front of all these people. You are just upset about dinner. Let us just go up to the executive suite and celebrate." "A team," I repeated, letting out a sharp, humorless laugh that echoed clearly across the grand promenade. That is absolutely fascinating, Julian. Because I vividly remember sitting at our kitchen table exactly 2 years ago when I was first forming my commercial investment firm. I asked you to co-sign the initial small business loan. I asked you to be my partner. Do you remember exactly what you told me? Julian swallowed hard, his face suddenly draining of all color. He looked down at his shoes, entirely unable to meet my gaze. He knew exactly what was coming, and he knew there was no way to spin it. I made sure every single person in the lobby, including Sterling and the stoic security guards, heard my next words. You looked me dead in the eye and called my ambition a stupid pipe dream. You told me I was completely delusional for thinking a woman with my working-class background could ever play in the big leagues. You laughed at me, Julian. Jada, please, Julian whispered, his voice cracking with desperation. That was a long time ago. I was just stressed about our finances. I was trying to be responsible. I did not mean it. You meant every single word, I fired back, stepping closer to him, forcing him to look up and face the devastating consequences of his own cowardice. And just to make absolutely certain that my inevitable failure did not ruin your precious credit score, you took immediate legal action. You had your corporate lawyer draft a legally binding postnuptial agreement, completely separating your personal assets from my limited liability company. You explicitly refused to put your name on a single piece of paperwork. You wanted absolutely nothing to do with the risk. You wanted to protect yourself from my failure. Julian stood there, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He looked frantically at his mother, hoping Vivian would somehow swoop in, raise her voice, and bully me into submission exactly like she had always done for him in the past. But Vivian was completely useless. She was still standing frozen near the concierge desk, staring blankly at the floor, entirely broken by the reality of her own irrelevance. Julian was completely on his own, and he had absolutely nothing left to bargain with. Well, congratulations, Julian, I continued, my voice ringing with absolute finality. You protected yourself perfectly. Your signature is nowhere on the deed to this property. Your name is nowhere on my corporate bank accounts. You have absolutely zero legal claim to Oakhaven Estate or any of the capital that funds it. My company bought this entire resort in cash, and I am the sole proprietor. You do not own a single grain of sand on this beach. The absolute truth of the situation finally sank into his brain. The immense wealth he thought he had just stumbled into vanished before his very eyes. The ultimate safety net he thought I was providing for his family was abruptly snatched away. He had spent 5 years treating me like an embarrassing burden, only to realize I was the only person in the room holding a winning lottery ticket. I squared my shoulders and looked at the man who had allowed his mother and brother to treat me like a maid for half a decade. There is no we, Julian, I said loudly, finalizing the absolute death of our marriage right there in the lobby. Before Julian could even attempt another pathetic apology, a sudden movement broke the tension. Trey aggressively pushed his way past his completely catatonic mother and marched toward the center of the lobby. He was sweating profusely, his face a deep, unhealthy shade of red, and his jaw was clenched in pure, unadulterated desperation. He simply could not accept this reality. If I was the owner of the resort, it meant I had complete access to the financial records. It meant I knew exactly how broke he truly was. It completely destroyed his carefully crafted alpha male persona. And he was willing to do absolutely anything to maintain the illusion just a few seconds longer. He pointed a trembling finger directly at me, his eyes wide and frantic. "She is lying," Trey shouted, his voice echoing harshly across the grand lobby. "She is completely broke. This is some kind of sick, elaborate prank to get back at my mother for dinner. She does not own anything." Trey marched right up to the marble concierge desk, completely ignoring the massive security guards who immediately stepped forward to intercept him. He slammed his hand down on the counter, glaring fiercely at Sterling. "Ring up my penthouse right now," Trey demanded, practically spitting the words out in his panic. "I do not need her fake charity, and I am not playing these stupid games anymore. Run the final bill. We are paying for the whole weekend right now." Trey stood at the marble concierge desk, his chest heaving as he stared down the general manager. He reached into the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick leather designer wallet. He snapped it open with an aggressive flick of his wrist. His fingers, which were visibly trembling just moments ago, suddenly steadied as he touched the familiar plastic and metal that had funded his entire fake life. He pulled out a heavy, solid metal platinum credit card. He held it up high for just a fraction of a second so that the lobby lights could catch the metallic gleam, making sure the wealthy guests watching from the lounge understood exactly what kind of financial firepower he was packing. Then he slammed the heavy card down onto the polished marble counter with a loud, authoritative clatter. "Do not worry about a thing," Mom Trey said loudly, turning his head to look back at Vivian. Vivian was still standing near the center of the lobby, looking completely hollowed out, but Trey was determined to play the savior. He puffed his chest out, completely leaning into his manufactured alpha male persona. "I am buying out the entire weekend right now. I am paying for the oceanfront penthouse, I am paying for your master suite, and I am covering every single meal we have eaten since we got off the ferry. We do not need to stand here and listen to these psychotic lies. And we certainly do not need to accept any fake ghetto charity from a woman who clearly needs a psychological evaluation." Chloe suddenly seemed to catch her breath. The sight of the platinum card temporarily rebooted her brain. She let out a shaky sigh of relief, clearly desperate to believe her husband's bravado. "That is right," baby Chloe chimed in, stepping closer to Trey and wrapping her hands around his arm. "Let us just pay the bill and go pack our bags. We can charter a private boat back to the mainland tonight. I cannot spend another minute breathing the same air as her." I stood a few feet away, watching the entire performance with absolute chilling calm. Trey was practically vibrating with nervous energy, but he was putting on the acting performance of a lifetime. He truly believed that if he swiped that card, the machine would magically approve a massive charge, and he could walk out of the lobby with his dignity completely intact. He thought his sheer arrogance could override his massive corporate debt. Sterling did not immediately reach for the credit card. Instead, the general manager slowly lifted his head and looked directly at me. He was a professional through and through, and he was not going to process a transaction for a hostile guest without explicit permission from the owner. I met Sterling's gaze. I gave him a single, deliberate nod. "Let him pay," I said quietly. Sterling picked up the heavy metal platinum card. He stepped over to the primary point-of-sale terminal located right next to the receptionist. The lobby was incredibly quiet now. The string quartet was still on break, and the guests in the lounge had stopped pretending to drink their cocktails, entirely captivated by the unfolding drama. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. Sterling inserted the metal card into the chip reader. The terminal screen lit up, displaying the staggering total for their 3 days of luxury living, combined with the massive outstanding balance from their previous delinquent vacations. It was a number that could easily buy a luxury sports car in cash. The machine began to process. Trey crossed his arms over his chest and leaned back against the marble counter, projecting an aura of total boredom. He looked at Julian, who was still standing completely frozen in the middle of the room, and shook his head in disgust. "You really messed up this time, little brother," Trey sneered. "You let your wife humiliate our mother in public, and now you're going to lose everything. When I take the company public next year, do not even think about asking me for a board seat. You are completely dead to me." Julian flinched, looking frantically between me and Trey, his greedy excitement rapidly dissolving back into pure panic as he wondered if he had just backed the wrong horse, but Trey never got the chance to finish his gloating. A sharp, loud beep suddenly echoed across the quiet marble lobby. It was a harsh, unforgiving electronic tone that cut right through the heavy air. Sterling looked down at the terminal screen. A bright red error message was flashing across the display. Sterling reached out, pulled the heavy metal card from the chip reader, and placed it carefully back onto the marble counter right in front of Trey. "I am very sorry, sir," Sterling said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "Your financial institution has declined the transaction. The error code indicates insufficient funds." The silence that followed was absolute. Trey stared at the metal card sitting on the counter. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and pale. The confident, arrogant sneer melted off his features instantly. He blinked rapidly, his brain completely unable to process the words insufficient funds spoken aloud in a luxury hotel lobby. Chloe let go of his arm and took a quick step back. "What do you mean, declined?" Chloe asked, her voice high and breathless. "Trey, what is he talking about? Why did it decline?" Trey swallowed hard. A thick bead of sweat formed at his temple and rolled slowly down the side of his face. He aggressively snatched the card off the counter and shoved it back into his wallet. "It is a security hold," Trey stammered, his voice suddenly lacking all of its previous booming authority. "It is just a security hold. I have been spending a lot of money on corporate acquisitions this quarter, and the bank always flags massive luxury purchases when I travel out of state. It is a completely standard fraud prevention measure. It happens to high net worth individuals all the time." He was lying through his teeth, and every single person in the room knew it. The wealthy guests watching from the lounge exchanged knowing glances. High net worth individuals did not get declined for hotel bills. High net worth individuals had dedicated concierge bankers who pre-cleared their travel expenses before they ever arrived. Trey was drowning, and he was desperately thrashing in the water, trying to pull everyone down with him. Trey dug his trembling fingers back into his leather wallet. He pulled out a different card, a sleek black rewards card this time. He practically shoved it across the marble counter towards Sterling. "It is just a machine error," Trey demanded, his voice cracking slightly. "Run this one, and this. It is linked to a different offshore account. Just run it and get this over with." Sterling did not argue. He picked up the black card, walked back to the terminal, and inserted the chip. Trey stood entirely frozen, his eyes glued to the small digital screen of the card reader. He was sweating profusely now. His breathing was shallow and rapid. He was silently praying for a miracle, praying that the massive mountain of debt he had been hiding from his family for over a year would somehow magically disappear for just 5 seconds. The machine processed the request, the lobby held its collective breath, and then, the harsh electronic tone echoed across the marble walls once again. "Beep!" Sterling pulled the black card from the machine. He placed it next to the terminal and looked directly at Trey. "Declined again," Sir Sterling announced clearly. Trey stared at the black card sitting on the marble counter, his chest heaving as if he had just sprinted a marathon. The second electronic beep of the declined transaction hung in the air, echoing loudly in the absolute silence of the grand lobby. His jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. He let out a low, desperate growl of frustration and aggressively dug both hands into his leather wallet. He pulled out a third credit card, a heavy blue corporate card, and practically threw it at Sterling. "Run this one," Trey demanded, his voice cracking, entirely stripped of its usual booming authority. "Run it right now. The machine is broken. Your entire system is completely flawed. Run the card." Sterling did not react to the disrespect. He calmly picked up the third card, inserted it into the chip reader, and waited. The terminal processed the request for 3 agonizing seconds. Then, the sharp, unforgiving electronic tone pierced the quiet room for the third time. "Beep!" Sterling withdrew the blue card and placed it down next to the other 2. "I am sorry, sir." "Declined." Chloe let out a sharp, panicked gasp. Her hands began to shake violently. She dropped her small designer purse onto the floor and aggressively pulled out her smartphone. Her long acrylic nails clicked frantically against the glass screen as she frantically opened her mobile banking applications. I watched her perfectly manicured facade completely disintegrate in real time. Her eyes widened in absolute terror as she stared at the screen. She refreshed the page once, twice, 3 times, desperately hoping the numbers would magically change. Chloe gasped, her voice shrill and entirely devoid of her fake old money New England accent. "Trey, What is happening? The joint checking account is completely overdrawn. The emergency savings account is empty. Our primary credit line says it has been permanently suspended. There is absolutely nothing left. We literally have $0 available. Trey lunged forward and grabbed her arm, trying to physically pull the phone away from her. "Shut up, Chloe," he hissed through his teeth, his eyes darting frantically toward the wealthy resort guests who were sitting in the lounge, eagerly watching the spectacular meltdown. "Keep your voice down. I will fix it. Just let me make a phone call to the accounting department." "There is no accounting department to call, Trey," I said, my voice smooth and carrying effortlessly across the lobby. Vivian finally seemed to snap out of her catatonic state. She took a trembling step forward, her eyes darting between Trey's sweating face and the 3 rejected credit cards sitting on the marble counter. "Trey," Vivian whispered, her voice wavering with deep, unsettling fear. "What is she talking about? Why are your accounts empty? You told me business was booming. You told me you just closed a massive international shipping contract. Just call your private banker and clear this humiliating mess up right now." I looked at Vivian, feeling a cold wave of absolute satisfaction wash over me. She had spent 5 years treating my husband like a disappointment while worshipping the ground her oldest son walked on. Now, the golden pedestal was rapidly crumbling into dust. "Sterling," I said, keeping my gaze locked on Vivian, "please take your point-of-sale monitor and turn it around so my mother-in-law can see exactly how her golden child pays for his luxury vacations." Sterling immediately obliged. He grasped the edge of the heavy touchscreen monitor and swiveled it completely around on its mount so that the glowing screen faced the center of the lobby. The display was covered in lines of glaring red text. I stepped up next to the marble counter and pointed to the staggering total displayed at the bottom of the screen. "Look closely, Vivian," I instructed. Vivian stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she tried to comprehend the massive numbers illuminating the screen. Chloe covered her mouth with both hands, her breathing becoming shallow and erratic as she realized exactly what I was showing them. Julian, who had been completely silent since his own rejection, slowly crept closer to see the screen, his jaw dropping open in sheer disbelief. For the past 3 years, I explained, my voice loud, clear, and totally unrelenting. Trey has not paid a single dime for these extravagant family retreats. He has not been treating you to luxury accommodations out of the goodness of his heart, and he certainly has not been paying out of his own incredibly deep pockets. Every single thing your family has consumed on this property has been charged to a delinquent corporate account. I tapped the screen, scrolling through the itemized list of stolen hospitality. The private oceanfront couples massages, the imported caviar and vintage champagne, the sunset cruises on the resort yacht, the expensive silk robes Chloe requested from the spa. Every single luxury they flaunted to make me feel small was entirely stolen. The previous owners of this resort were terrified of him, I continued, looking directly at Trey, who was now staring at the floor, completely defeated. Trey used his fake aristocratic persona to bully the young receptionists and intimidate the management. When his cards inevitably declined, he would scream about banking errors and threaten to ruin the resort's reputation among his supposed elite network. The old owners were bleeding money and desperately wanted to avoid a public scandal, so they just let the debt roll over year after year. I pointed to the final number in bright red. $45,000, Vivian. That is exactly how much your highly successful son has stolen from this property. I discovered the active ledger this afternoon. I was the one who permanently froze his charging privileges while Chloe was busy complaining about my natural hair at the cabana. Vivian looked as though she might physically collapse. She clutched the edge of the marble desk to steady herself. Her entire worldview, her absolute certainty in her family's inherent superiority, was violently ripped away. She looked at Trey, waiting for him to deny it. She waited for him to scream, to call me a liar, to produce a briefcase full of cash to prove me wrong. But Trey said absolutely nothing. His silence was the loudest confession possible. I turned my attention to Chloe. She was weeping now, large, ugly tears ruining her expensive makeup and streaking down her face. She looked absolutely pathetic, a desperate grifter whose elaborate costume had finally been torn off. "You love to talk about your old money pedigree, Chloe," I said, my voice dripping with icy contempt. "You love to tell everyone who would listen that you summered in Newport and grew up in high society. But I ran a full financial background check during the acquisition audit. Your supposed family trust fund dried up over 5 years ago. You have been floating on maxed-out department store credit cards and predatory personal loans ever since. You are not royalty. You are a fraud." Chloe let out a loud, miserable sob and buried her face in her hands, completely unable to defend herself. Finally, I turned back to Trey. He slowly lifted his head, his eyes red and filled with a mixture of absolute hatred and profound panic. He knew exactly what was coming next. He knew I had the final piece of the puzzle, the ultimate secret he had been desperately hiding from his mother and his wife to maintain his fragile ego. "And Trey," I said, stepping right into his personal space, forcing him to look me directly in the eyes. "I know exactly why those credit cards declined today. Your highly successful logistics company did not just have a bad quarter. You are not waiting on a massive international contract to clear. You have absolutely zero revenue." I let the silence hang in the air for a fraction of a second, ensuring every single person in the grand lobby was listening closely. "You aren't old money, Chloe," I said. "And Trey, your logistics company filed for bankruptcy 11 months ago. I know, because my investment firm bought your liquidated warehouse." The word bankruptcy hung in the cool, air-conditioned air of the grand lobby like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Trey stood completely paralyzed, his eyes wide and vacant as he stared at me. He had spent the last 11 months meticulously weaving an elaborate web of lies, carefully hiding his financial ruin from everyone in his life. He had forged documents to show his mother, he had lied to his wife, and he had continued to parade around high society events acting like a titan of industry. But the moment I mentioned the liquidated warehouse, the moment I named the specific commercial asset my firm had purchased at auction for pennies on the dollar, the final thread of his massive deception completely snapped. He had absolutely no defense left. There was no banking error to blame. There was no arrogant excuse he could pull from his tailored suit pocket. He just stood there, his mouth opening and closing silently, utterly destroyed by the truth. Beside him, Vivian underwent a terrifying physical transformation. The last remaining drops of color vanished from her face, leaving her skin an ashen, sickly gray. She swayed slightly on her expensive heels, looking as though all the bones in her body had suddenly turned to dust. She slowly turned her head to look at her oldest son. When she finally spoke, her voice was not the booming, authoritative bark that had terrorized me for 5 years. It was a fragile, hollow whisper. "Bankrupt?" Vivian asked, her eyes darting frantically across Trey's sweating face. "Trey, what is she talking about? What does she mean they liquidated your warehouse? You told me the business was expanding. You told me you were opening a new distribution center on the coast." Trey swallowed hard, taking a slight step backward away from his mother. "Mom, it is not what it sounds like," Trey stammered, his voice trembling uncontrollably. "It was just a strategic restructuring. It was Chapter 11. I just had to shuffle some assets around to maximize our quarterly tax benefits. I am going to bounce back next month." "It was Chapter 7, total liquidation," I corrected loudly, making sure my voice carried over his pathetic excuses. "And you are not bouncing back. Your company was drowning in millions of dollars of unsecured debt, and the bank seized absolutely everything. You do not even own the luxury car you drove up here in. The leasing company has been trying to repossess it for 6 weeks." Vivian let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. She lunged forward and grabbed the lapels of Trey's expensive suit jacket, shaking him with a sudden, violent burst of desperate energy. "Tell me, she is lying," Vivian screamed, her voice cracking and echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the lobby. "Tell me right now, Trey, because if you are bankrupt, where did my money go? Where is the $300,000 I transferred to your account last October? The lobby erupted in a wave of shocked whispers from the wealthy guests watching the spectacle. Julian, who was still hovering near the edge of the confrontation, let out a loud gasp of pure horror. "Mom!" Julian shouted, stepping forward and staring at Vivian with wide, terrified eyes. "What do you mean, $300,000? That was the primary retirement fund. Dad left that money for you to live on." Vivian did not even look at Julian. She kept her frantic, tear-filled eyes entirely locked on Trey. "I gave you everything," Vivian sobbed, her manicured fingers digging into his suit jacket. "I took out a second mortgage on my house. I liquidated my entire stock portfolio. I emptied the retirement accounts to pay for your massive mortgage and your luxury cars. You told me you just needed a small bridge loan to float your lifestyle until Chloe's trust fund cleared probate. You swore to me you would pay it all back with interest." Trey violently shoved his mother's hands off his chest, his embarrassment suddenly morphing into vicious, defensive anger. "Well, what was I supposed to do?" Trey yelled right back at her, completely abandoning any pretense of respect. Chloe was spending $10,000 a month on clothes and spa treatments. She refused to fly commercial. "You are the one who constantly pressured us to maintain the family image. You are the one who forced us to come to this ridiculously expensive resort every single year so you could show off to your friends. I was drowning, and you just kept demanding that we look like royalty." The entire family dynamic completely imploded right there on the marble floor. The carefully constructed facade of aristocratic loyalty shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces, and they instantly turned on each other like a pack of starving wolves. Chloe, who had been weeping silently into her hands, suddenly snapped her head up. Her face was streaked with black mascara, and her pristine white linen outfit was wrinkled from her panic. When she opened her mouth, the soft, breathy, highly refined New England accent she had used to mock me all afternoon was completely gone. Her voice was harsh, nasal, and totally unrecognizable. "Are you seriously blaming me right now?" Chloe shrieked, taking a furious step toward Trey and shoving him hard in the chest. "You told me you were a millionaire when I met you. You told me I would never have to work a day in my life. You promised me a penthouse in the city and a house in the Hamptons. I gave you the best years of my life, and you are nothing but a broke loser playing dress-up." Trey let out a bitter, cruel laugh. "You gave me your best years," Trey mocked, his face twisting with pure disgust. "You are a glorified mall kiosk worker from a trailer park in Ohio. You watched too much reality television and decided to fake a trust fund to trap a rich husband." "There is no trust fund, is there, Chloe? There is no old money pedigree. You have been running a scam from the very beginning." Chloe let out a furious scream and slapped Trey directly across the face. The sharp, cracking sound echoed loudly across the lobby. Trey stumbled backward, holding his reddening cheek, looking absolutely murderous. Security guards immediately tensed, taking a step forward to intervene, but Sterling held up a single hand, signaling them to hold their position and let the absolute disaster play out. Vivian fell to her knees right in the middle of the lobby, completely unable to support her own weight anymore. She covered her face with her hands, letting out loud, agonizing wails of despair. Her entire life was a lie. She had drained every single penny she owned to fund the fake lifestyle of a bankrupt son and a grifting daughter-in-law. She had mortgaged her home, destroyed her retirement, and alienated her younger son, all for the sake of an image that did not actually exist. She was officially, undeniably, completely destitute. Julian stood frozen in horror, watching his mother weep on the floor, while his brother and sister-in-law continued to aggressively scream at each other over stolen money and fake trust funds. He slowly turned his head to look at me. His eyes were utterly hollow. He realized that the woman he had just publicly rejected, the woman he had allowed his family to treat like absolute garbage, was standing in the center of her own multi-million-dollar empire, completely untouched by the flames consuming his family. I stood calmly on the polished marble floor, watching the fire burn. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I did not feel an ounce of guilt. I felt nothing but the pure, cleansing warmth of absolute justice. I had given them exactly what they asked for. I let them show their true colors to the world, and the world was currently watching them destroy themselves. Vivian's loud sobbing slowly began to subside into pathetic, wet hiccups. She remained on the floor for a long moment, her chest heaving as the brutal reality of her financial ruin settled deeply into her bones. She had no money, she had no house, she had absolutely no powerful connections to save her. Then, Vivian slowly lowered her hands from her face. She looked up from the marble floor, her bloodshot eyes scanning the room until they locked directly onto me. I watched the gears desperately turn in her head. I watched her completely abandon the last shred of her dignity. She realized that I was the absolute only person in the room with any actual wealth. I was the only person who could save her from spending the rest of her life in crushing poverty. Vivian slowly scrambled to her feet, her expensive silk dress ruined and wrinkled. She wiped the smeared makeup from her cheeks with the back of her trembling hand. The vicious, arrogant monster who had demanded my removal just 20 minutes ago completely vanished. She took a slow, unsteady step toward me, forcing her face into a sickeningly sweet, desperate expression. Her eyes filled with fresh, pleading tears as she reached her hands out toward me, suddenly trying to play the loving, misunderstood mother-in-law. Vivian took another unsteady step toward me. The tears streaming down her face were no longer tears of rage or entitlement. They were tears of absolute, pathetic desperation. She reached her hands out, her fingers trembling as she desperately tried to grasp my arm, but I took a smooth step backward, ensuring she could not touch me. "Jada," Vivian began, her voice shaking with a manufactured warmth that made my stomach turn. "Jada, my sweet girl, please, you have to listen to me. We are family. You know I always saw so much potential in you. From the very first day Julian brought you home, I knew you were destined for absolute greatness. I pushed you because I wanted you to succeed." The audacity was almost impressive. She was standing in the middle of the lobby, surrounded by the shattered pieces of her fake aristocratic life, attempting to rewrite 5 years of relentless emotional abuse as some kind of twisted maternal motivation. "You cannot do this to us," Jada Vivian pleaded, her voice cracking as she glanced back at Trey, who was still staring blankly at the floor. "You cannot put us out on the street. We have absolutely nothing left. You are a good Christian woman. You are my daughter. You have to help us." I looked at the woman who had spent half a decade ensuring I never felt welcome at her dinner table. I looked at the woman who had just tried to have me physically thrown out of my own property by security guards. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no pity. There was no lingering desire for her approval. The emotional hold she once had over me was completely eradicated. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I simply looked at her with the cold, detached professionalism of a corporate investor dealing with a severe liability. "We are not family, Vivian," I replied, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet lobby. "We are simply two people who happen to know the same spineless man, and you did not push me to succeed. You tried to bury me so your bankrupt son could look taller. But you failed." Vivian let out a broken sob, her hands dropping to her sides. I turned my head slightly and made a subtle gesture to Sterling. The general manager immediately stepped forward. He reached inside his tailored navy suit jacket and produced a thick, heavy manila envelope. He held it out toward Vivian with absolute professional indifference. Vivian stared at the envelope as if it were a live grenade. She slowly reached out with a trembling hand and took it from Sterling. The flap was unsealed. She pulled out a massive stack of pristine white papers. "What is this?" Vivian whispered, her eyes frantically scanning the top page. "That is the cold hard truth," I answered smoothly. "It is a fully itemized bill. It covers every single stolen vacation, Every single bottle of imported vintage champagne, every single private oceanfront massage, and every single unpaid gourmet meal your family has consumed on this property over the last 3 years. Vivian flipped through the pages, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow as she saw the endless columns of exorbitant charges. The sheer volume of their theft was printed out in black and white, undeniable and legally binding. I had my accounting department drafted up while you were busy trying to humiliate me at dinner, I continued, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. The total comes to exactly $48,215. That includes the penthouse and the master suite for this weekend, as well as the room service Chloe ordered this afternoon. Trey finally snapped out of his catatonic state. He looked up, his eyes wide with renewed panic. "You cannot legally enforce that," Trey stammered, his voice weak and completely devoid of confidence. "Those charges were billed to a corporate entity. The company is in Chapter 11. You have to get in line with the other creditors. You cannot hold us personally liable." I turned to look at Trey, offering him a sharp, victorious smile. "Actually, Trey, I can. Because when you checked in at the front desk 3 days ago, you signed a standard liability waiver explicitly stating that the primary guest assumes total personal financial responsibility for any corporate account that fails to clear. You signed it yourself. And since Vivian is the primary cardholder on the only functional account linked to your profile, the debt legally falls directly onto her remaining assets." Vivian let out a sharp gasp, clutching the thick stack of papers to her chest. She looked at Trey with pure, unadulterated hatred. "You forged my signature on the liability waiver," Vivian screamed at him, her voice cracking. "You put this massive debt in my name without telling me." Trey took a step backward, holding his hands up defensively. "Mom, I was going to pay it back. I just needed a little more time." "You have absolutely no time left," I interrupted, cutting off his pathetic excuses. "And I expect that balance to be settled in full by the end of the business week. My corporate attorneys will be contacting you on Monday morning to discuss the payment plan. If you fail to comply, we will place a heavy lien on whatever assets you managed to hide from the bankruptcy court." Vivian fell silent, the fight completely drained out of her. She was holding a bill she could never afford to pay, standing in front of a woman she could no longer control. She looked down at the marble floor, completely defeated. "Please, Jada," Vivian whispered, her voice barely audible. "We do not have $48,000. We do not have anywhere to go tonight. Please, just let us stay in our rooms until the morning. Just give us one night." I looked at her, remembering the cruel smirk on her face just an hour ago when she tried to banish me to the kitchen. I remembered the exact words she had used to try and strip away my dignity in front of the entire dining terrace. I smoothed the front of my silk evening gown and looked directly into Vivian's tear-filled eyes. "The help doesn't pay for the family," I said quietly. I turned away from her completely and gave a firm, decisive nod to the two massive security guards standing ready behind the concierge desk. The two massive security guards immediately stepped out from behind the marble counter. They moved with swift military precision, their faces completely devoid of any sympathy. One guard positioned himself directly behind Trey, while the other stepped right up to Vivian and Chloe. Sterling stepped out from behind the desk as well, maintaining his perfect professional posture. "It is time for you to leave the property," Sterling announced, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "You will be escorted to your respective rooms. You have exactly 15 minutes to pack your belongings under the direct supervision of my security team. If you attempt to take any resort property, including the bathrobes or the complimentary toiletries, local law enforcement will be called immediately to formally charge you with theft." Trey opened his mouth to argue, but the security guard behind him simply placed a heavy, firm hand on his shoulder. The fight instantly left Trey. He hung his head, entirely defeated, and began walking toward the east corridor. Chloe followed closely behind him, her face buried in her hands. her loud sobs echoing down the hallway. Vivian stood frozen for a moment longer. She looked around the grand lobby, her eyes taking in the glittering chandeliers, the polished marble floors, and the wealthy guests who were openly staring at her spectacular downfall. She had spent her entire life worshipping this kind of luxury, tearing down anyone she deemed unworthy of it. Now, she was being thrown out of it like common trash. She did not look back at me again. She simply turned around and began the long, humiliating walk to her room, trailed closely by the second security guard. The packing process was a masterclass in total humiliation. I stood near the entrance of the promenade and watched the security feeds on my master tablet. I watched Trey frantically stuffing his expensive tailored suits into his designer luggage, while the guard stood silently in the doorway, ensuring he did not touch the minibar. I watched Chloe desperately trying to fit her massive collection of shoes into her bags, her hands shaking so violently she could barely operate the zippers. I watched Vivian moving like a ghost in the master suite, tossing her silk dresses into her suitcase with absolutely no care for how they wrinkled. Exactly 15 minutes later, they emerged from the elevators. They were dragging their heavy luxury luggage across the polished marble floor. There were no bellhops rushing over to assist them. There was no concierge wishing them a safe journey home. The other resort guests actively stepped out of their way, giving them a wide berth as if their sudden poverty was a highly contagious disease. The security guards marched them straight through the main lobby, pushing open the heavy glass front doors. The humid night air immediately rushed in. The guards escorted them down the front steps, past the valet station, and directed them down the long, paved driveway. They were not allowed to wait on the grand front porch. They were forced to walk the entire half-mile down the dark driveway until they reached the public iron gates that separated Oakhaven Estate from the main road. I switched the camera feed on my tablet to the front gate security camera. The image was perfectly clear. There they were. The aristocratic Spencer family, standing on the side of a dark public road in the middle of the night. The island mosquitoes were swarming aggressively in the humid air. Trey was violently swatting at his neck, his pastel polo shirt drenched in sweat. Chloe was sitting on top of her suitcase, crying miserably into her hands. Vivian was standing perfectly still under the dim glow of a street lamp, staring blankly into the dark woods, completely broken. They were waiting for a cheap rideshare car to come and carry them away from the empire they thought they ruled. I locked my tablet and slid it back into my designer bag. The lobby was finally quiet again. The show was officially over. I turned around to head toward the elevators, but a sudden movement caught my eye. Julian had not followed his family out the front doors. My husband had stayed behind. He was standing near the grand fireplace, completely alone. When he saw me turn around, he did not hesitate. He ran across the marble floor and completely collapsed. He fell to his knees right in front of me. "Jada, please," Julian begged, his voice cracking with desperate, ugly tears. "Please, baby, do not do this. Do not leave me. I was wrong. I was so incredibly wrong. I should have stood up to them. I should have defended you." He reached out and tried to grab the hem of my silk evening gown, but I stepped back, looking down at him with utter disgust. "I will cut them off," Julian cried, his face red and slick with tears. "I swear to you right now, I will never speak to my mother again. I will block Trey's number. I will completely cut them out of my life. It can just be you and me. We can run this place together. I can help you manage the firm. Please just give me one more chance to prove I can be a real husband." He was absolutely pathetic. He was perfectly willing to let his mother treat me like garbage for 5 years, but the exact second he realized I was a millionaire, he was ready to throw his entire family under a bus to save his own skin. He did not love me. He loved the safety net I had secretly built. He loved the power he thought he could extract from me. I looked down at the man kneeling on the floor. I slowly reached into my designer bag. I bypassed the master tablet and pulled out a pristine, thick manila envelope. I had my corporate attorneys draft the documents inside weeks before we ever packed our bags for this trip. I had simply been waiting for the perfect moment to deliver them. I held the envelope out and dropped it. It landed directly on his chest with a soft, heavy thud. Julian scrambled to catch it, his hands shaking as he looked at the return address from my legal team. "What is this?" he whispered, his eyes wide with fear. "Those are your divorce papers," I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "I signed them on Tuesday. The settlement is incredibly straightforward. You keep your completely separate personal assets exactly like you demanded in our post-nuptial agreement 2 years ago, and I keep absolutely everything I built without you." Julian stared at the manila envelope as if it were covered in poison. "No," Julian gasped, shaking his head frantically. "No, we can fix this. We can go to counseling. You cannot just throw 5 years of marriage away." "I already did, Julian," I replied softly. "Now pick up your pride off this floor and get out of my lobby." I gave a single nod to the last remaining security guard standing near the front desk. The guard immediately marched over, grabbed Julian firmly by the arm, and hauled him to his feet. Julian tried to resist, trying to call my name one last time, but the guard was entirely too strong. He physically escorted my soon-to-be ex-husband toward the heavy glass doors. "Go wait at the gate with your mother, Julian," I called out as the doors swung open. The glass doors closed shut, sealing the humid air and the toxic baggage of my past outside forever. I took a deep, cleansing breath. The air inside the lobby felt lighter. The entire resort felt as though it had just been washed clean. I walked past the concierge desk, offering Sterling a warm, appreciative smile, and made my way to the private VIP elevators. I swiped my master key card and pressed the button for the top floor. I bypassed the master suite where Vivian had stayed. I walked all the way down the quiet, plushly carpeted hallway until I reached the heavy oak double doors of the oceanfront penthouse. I unlocked the doors and stepped inside. The penthouse was spectacular. Trey and Chloe had left it in a frantic mess, but I did not care. I walked straight past their discarded clothing and headed directly for the massive mahogany wet bar. I found a bottle of top shelf, 20-year-old bourbon. I poured myself a generous measure into a heavy crystal glass, the amber liquid glowing warmly in the dim light. I carried the glass across the sprawling living room and pushed open the floor-to-ceiling glass doors leading out to the private wraparound balcony. The cool ocean breeze washed over my face. The sound of the crashing waves was a perfect, rhythmic symphony. I walked to the edge of the balcony and looked down. Far below, at the very edge of the property line, I could see the dim glow of the street lamp by the front gate. I saw the headlights of a cheap sedan pulling up to the curb. I watched as 4 small, defeated figures struggled to load their heavy designer luggage into the cramped trunk. I took a slow, incredibly satisfying sip of my bourbon as the car doors slammed shut. The sedan pulled away from the curb, its red taillights slowly fading into the absolute darkness of the coastal highway. They were gone. I turned around and walked back inside the penthouse. I set my crystal glass down on the solid oak dining table. I reached into my bag one last time and pulled out my sleek silver laptop. I opened it up, the screen illuminating the dark room. I bypassed my email and opened a massive, highly detailed digital file. They were the new architectural plans for the complete expansion of Oakhaven Estate. I sat down at the table, running my fingers over the trackpad, examining the blueprints for the new luxury spa and the upgraded private villas. I was 35 years old. I was a self-made millionaire. I had completely dismantled the toxic family that tried to break me, and I had done it without raising my voice or losing my dignity. I was wealthy. I was entirely unburdened. And for the first time in my entire life, I was completely and absolutely in control of my own narrative. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If you have ever had to cut toxic people out of your life to protect your peace and build your own empire, let me know in the comments below. Do not forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about taking your power back. Until next time, remember that you write your own ending, and you never have to apologize for demanding the respect you deserve.